The Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, as its name implies, is an institute of Dakar University geared primarily to fundamental research, particularly in the fields of the human and natural sciences. As such, its essential aim is to study the black men of Africa, their prehistory and history, their languages and arts, and in general, the society where they have lived. In other words, the main purpose of the institute is to prepare a systematic list of the physical and biological environment in which the Negro African lives and moves and has his being, as well as to compile, conserve, and enhance basic material necessary for a thorough understanding of Black Africa. Indo-African Studies. In short, IFAN is an organization whose primary purpose is to stimulate, promote, and publish scientific studies on Black Africa in general and West Africa in particular. In other words, Senegal has in this university institution a privileged instrument for the implementation of its cultural policy, which is primarily the will to ensure that it is grounded in the values of Negro Africa, in a word, in negritude. However, although its task was primarily to foster the cultural rebirth of Black Africa, IFAN has just extended its sphere of activity to the Indian subcontinent by creating a Department of Indo-African Studies. Why this innovation? This is precisely what I wish to talk to you about today. Before going any further, I should like to thank my countryman Cheikh Tidiane Ndegdiaye, who is now preparing a thesis for a doctorate on Wolof, one of the languages in the Senegalese Guinean group, and the Dravidian languages. Through his research, he has been able to confirm what Miss Lilias Homburger, my professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, used to suggest to us, namely, the kinship of the Negro-African languages and the Dravidian languages. This lecture owes much to Mr. Ndiaye. Lecture delivered in Madras under the auspices of the International Institute Affinity between India and Black Africa. If I have decided that IFAN should bracket India and Black Africa for purposes of study in the same research department, it was for several reasons. Some of them subjective, of course, but most of them objective. The first of the subjective reasons is that in terms of geography, the Indians are our neighbors to us who live in the Sudanese Sahelian zone. Besides, in the 50s, I met Mr. Malcolm Adisa Shia, who was then the UNESCO Deputy Director General. We became friends, and he revealed to me the realities of Dravidian life, which ever since then I have found to be very close to the realities of life in Negro Africa. Dravidian life is very close to the realities of life in Africa. Southern India is in the same latitude as Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. More than this, only the Indian Ocean separates the eastern coast of Africa from the south of India. As a matter of fact, geologists maintain that the Indian subcontinent was formerly attached to East Africa. In this respect, the findings of marine biology are of outstanding importance. All that is needed, therefore, is for archaeologists and prehistorians to have a chance to explore the depths of the seas to discover old lithic industries or human skeleton fossils in the area stretching from East Africa to southern India. Unless, of course, the Indian Ocean existed long before the human race appeared. In any case, Tamil legends refer to the existence from time immemorial of flourishing cities long since buried beneath the seas. This is perhaps a reference to that stretch of land which was supposed to have linked India and Africa and was presumably engulfed by the ocean during the Neolithic Revolution. That is to say, the period of prehistory when Homo sapiens achieved his first revolution by laying the foundations of the recorded civilizations through new techniques he had invented. I should like in passing to note that it is not at all fortuitous that the early civilizations which arose in the valleys of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and lastly of the Indus, bore the marks of black men. It might, however, be quite simply a vague memory of the universal flood to which the Kankams tried to give a poetic interpretation in their oldest literary masterpieces such as the Silapathikaram. In any case, it is remarkable that the Pithecanthrops proconsuls and Australopithecus, who whilst not the ancestors of the human species, are zoologically their next of kin as infra- and para-hominians, proliferated simultaneously in East Africa and southern India. Here is what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin wrote in his book L'apparition de l'homme, The Appearance of Man. It was on a tropical and subtropical area of the Old World, an area which in fact extended across India to Malaysia, but basically located on the African continent, that the evolution of the higher primates gradually took place. Consequently, if it were established that East Africa and the Indian subcontinent had been linked, we would then have to qualify the thesis which claims East Africa as the cradle of mankind, a thesis supported by many of the greatest prehistorians and anthropologists, amongst whom I shall mention Camille Arambourg and Henri Breuil, Louis Hiers, B. Leakey and Van Rietlo, Marcelin Boule and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. In other words, one should not consider only East Africa as the cradle of mankind, but rather the area stretching from East Africa to southern India. Thus restated, this theory would not be too much at variance with Islamic belief, which claims that Adam, the father of mankind, appeared in India and Awa, our maternal ancestor, in southern Arabia, and that they met at Harafat. It is a curious coincidence that Atan is the word for father in Tamil, Bin and Em, being interchangeable in that language, and Ava, the word for mother in Kannada, Ave in Tamil, Av in Kota, Ave in Kodagu. But beyond considerations of geography or even of geology and zoology, there are the links of history. Indeed, because they are located on either side of Arabia and the Semitic world, it was quite natural that from the time the Arabs began to penetrate into foreign countries, India and Black Africa should be the countries to have been first and most profoundly influenced by the Islamic movement. So much so that the contributions of Arabo-Islamic civilization, in a word of Arabity, to Indianity and negritude are considerable and substantially of equal value. These influences are, in fact, reciprocal, for when the Semites arrived in the Middle East, they found black people living there already. Besides, because they both were located at the crossroads of great lines of communication used by the colonial powers from the 15th to the 17th centuries of our era, to discover new lands, India and Black Africa were bound to feel the influence now of the Portuguese, now of the British, now of the French. The Sera word Sibula and the Wolof Sobel. On the other hand, Sabula in Malayalam, a language spoken in the heart of Kerala state. Similarly, the Wolof word Ki, Kabi, and the same word in many Indian languages derived directly from the Portuguese Kavi. And much stronger still than the sentimental links of colonial history are the anthropological ones. I mean those links between the Dravidians and the Black Africans. It is indeed beyond question that the Dravidians share the same black blood as their brothers in Africa and those of the diaspora. The ancient Greeks did not err when they called all black peoples Aethiopes. They made a distinction only between the Eastern Ethiopians, or the blacks from Asia, and the Western Ethiopians, or blacks from Africa. As they were keen observers, they subdivided these into straight hair, wavy hair, and curly hair. I refer you to Snowden Jr.'s outstanding work, Blacks in Antiquity, Origin of the Dravidian Race. We know that some anthropologists tried to identify the Dravidians with what is known as the Mediterranean race. Such a general label, which conceals gaps in our knowledge of anthropology, is indeed confusing. I had almost said dangerous, since it could suggest an interpretation of the concept of race in terms of geographical demarcation. The notion of race, when stripped of certainly accessory details, boils down essentially to skin color. This is the sense in which we speak of black race, white race. Consequently, it might have been less ambiguous, as some experts have done, to call that the Mediterranean race the Negroid race, since its characteristics are precisely those of the blacks in general. An elongated skull, dark or brown skin, these two adjectives being quite often euphemisms for black. I refer you to Alexander More's description of the ancient Mediterraneans. This is the place to mention once again the fact that the ancient Greeks did not label as white the former inhabitants of northwest Africa, that is to say, of the present Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, since they called the inhabitants Moroa or Moors, meaning men with a dark skin. And Herodotus tells us that the Colchidians, a Middle East people, were as black as Egyptians. In any case, as I stated in a lecture I gave at Cairo University in February 1967, on the foundations of Africanity or negritude and Arabism, my professor at the Ethnological Institute in Paris, Dr. Paul Rivet, used to say there is a ratio of 4 to 18% black blood around the Mediterranean Sea. He thus referred to the Negroids of the early Paleolithic and Mesolithic, Grimaldi man and Caspian man, an important group of the Mediterranean populations until the Neolithic. Need I mention the other tendency met with among certain anthropologists and ethnologists who classify the Dravidians and Ethiopians, the Somalis and Sudanese, the Nilotic people and Fayols and Tutsis under the general label of Hamitic race. Here again, I would say that such a formula is confusing. For the Ethiopians and those groups, although marginal Negroes are undoubtedly blacks, as Berbers in general are marginal whites. As a matter of fact, the word Hamite, which does not refer to anything else but black people, whether they are described as marginal, if you wish, is only a political pretext. How indeed can we speak of as black-skinned people, who may not be deemed as blacks or Negroes, and, at the same time, describe very white-skinned Americans as Negroes because they have a drop of black blood? We shall not mention all the theories on the origins of the Dravidians, since the problem is still very much unsolved. We shall mention one only, namely, a black subrace among the populations of southern India. This said, we should not underrate the importance of the blood ties between Dravidians and black Africans, especially as the black Dravidian subrace is the same as the black East African subrace, which is to be found in the same latitude. During my last visit to Addis Ababa, I was very much impressed with the large number of Ethiopians, who, with their fine features, black skin and straight hair, look like Dravidians. I mentioned this to the emperor, who with a knowing air merely smiled a royal smile. In short, as we can see, the similarity between India and black Africa is essentially based on geography, anthropology, and history. It is this similarity that I would now like to develop by touching on culture, that is to say, on the values of civilization. Cultural context. First, on the subject of ethnology, we have facts to which certain authors, particularly German ethnologists, have drawn attention. Foremost among them is Leo Frobenius, who had defined Eritrean culture as being probably the survival of an ancient culture common to southern Asia, more particularly to India and black Africa. This culture probably came to Africa via the north and the south, on the one hand, from the Red Sea and Ethiopia, on the other, via the Mozambique coast. Of the characteristics of this cultural cycle, I shall dwell mainly on metallurgy and cotton spinning, which will enable me to prove that in actual fact. Eritrean culture is the survival of an ancient Indo-African. As regards metallurgy, the following comparisons might be made. In Wolof Sanjar, bronze; in Pular Sanjara, Vankara or work in bronze; in Bambara Numu, forge; and in Telugu Inumu, iron; in Wolof Kamara, name given to the blacksmith's caste; and in Telugu Kamara, name given to the blacksmith's caste. This latter name can be found in other Dravidian languages and in some Indo-Aryan ones as well. As to cotton spinning, the Wolof use of the word ec, producing yarn from raw cotton, which can be compared with the Pengo verb ec, meaning to card cotton. After Leo Frobenius, G. Montandon defined 7 cultural cycles in Black Africa, 4 of which were supposed to be related to certain sectors in India, Malaysia, and the Oceanic Islands. Using D.P. de Pedralza enumeration of the elements of these 4 cultural cycles, we have been able to detect the following elements. 1. In the totemic cycle we have totemism, the exogamic patriarchal clans, initiation tests for adolescent youth with sexual mutilations, the round hut with cone-shaped roof, the sheath of the penis or the phallic sheath, and the use of the assegai. 2. In the paleo-matriarchal cycle we have the matriarchate, exogamic matrimonial classes, initiation ceremonies for women, secret societies for men wearing masks, ancestral worship, the mythology of the moon, magic, wooden drums, the use of the hoe for tilling, and the square gabled hut. 3. In the neo-matriarchal cycle, we have the matriarchate, monogamy, ceremonies accompanying the first menstrual period, ancestor worship, magic, trellis work, basket making, ceramics. the use of the hoe for tilling, the domestication of dogs and poultry, and houses on stilts or pillars. Fourth, in the pastoral cycle we have animal husbandry, breastfeeding, metallurgy, social classes, the round-domed hut. As you will have noticed, we have, in each of these cultural cycles, deliberately underlined one or two elements to indicate our intention to expand on them. As regards totemism, it should be noted that the word Kaba, which denotes the peacock in Kuruk, is to be found in the Wolof proper name job, which is given to all the members of the clan whose totem is the peacock. People actually say, don't they, Jambe Job, which means the peacock's name is Diob. Or again, Joba Juba, which is a hypocoristic way of calling all the individual members of the group whose totem is the peacock. Moreover, Mr. Chaiktidian Nadiai has told me that he discovered, among other things, the rule of phonologic similarity, which is as follows: the sonorous palatal J in Wolof, the dull palatal C in Dravidian. As regards the use of the Assegai, the Wolof word Zej Assegai may be equated with the Gondi Muria term, Kach Assegai. The following morphophonologic rule should be noted in passing: Wolof, CVVC, Dravidian, CVCC. On the question of the use of the hoe for tilling, the Wolof word konko, a curved hoe, is exactly the same as the Nike word konki, a curved hoe. I should like to refer you to the Dravidian Etymological Dictionary, 1689. Where the domestication of dogs and poultry is concerned, one can easily identify the Wolof word kuti, a pup, with the Tamil word kuti, a pup. Also, the Wolof woldkur, which is generally used to call poultry, with the Kuiker word used for calling poultry, as was noted by W.S. Winfield. Lastly, turning to animal husbandry, the following comparisons are quite significant. In Wolof Zar, sheep, and in Brawi Zar, a ram eye, in Wolof Nag, cow, in Serai Nek, in Pula Naga, and in Tamil Naku Pajimeva, a goat in Serai Lebir. To milk, in Pula Birde, and in Kondapur. Apart from Leo Frobenius and G. Montandon, H. Bauman and D. Westerman also had a word to say about the ethnic relations between India and Black Africa. Indeed, in their work entitled The Peoples and Civilizations of Africa, they hold the view that certain farming methods in the Neo-Sudanese cultural cycle, manuring the ground, terracing, irrigation canals, etc., are due to a wave of men who came from southern India via Abyssinia or Ethiopia. It would appear that the path they followed from the Nile to Senegal was studded with certain agricultural implements, as well as with megalithic monuments associated with agrarian forms of worship. French Union 1 pointed out the similarity that existed between various articles found in Togo and those of India, such as war hatchets, daggers with ring-shaped hilts, ankle rings, etc. It is these articles that D.P. de Pedros had picked out as being elements in Montaudan's Soudanois cultural cycle, to which he had added jewels, matched by comparable ones in India. In short, it is in the context of all these ethnic affinities that Ratzel's famous dictum must be set. Practically the whole of Africa seems to be one great unit of echoes from Asia, attenuated in varying degrees. Dravidian and Negro-African languages, we have been dealing with linguistics through ethnology. We should now like to go back and say a few words on the kinship of Dravidian and Negro-African languages. In the 19th century, Alfredo Trombetti was one of the first to have the presentiment that Dravidian and Negro-African languages represented a common language, akin to Sumerian. Recently, in a letter to a Cameroonian friend, Father Englebert Maveng, on the deciphering of the writing of the first civilization recorded in the Indus Valley, I wrote as follows. You have probably thought, like me, of making a comparison between Egyptian, Dravidian, and Sumerian writing. I have the impression that the same blood, or better still, the same spirit of the blacks, runs through those three civilizations. In any case, it was Negroid people who first occupied the valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and northwest India, where they founded the first agrarian civilizations in the Neolithic. These first settlers of the eastern valleys, wrote Alexandre Moret, were Negroid peoples who came from regions in India and Africa, driven north, when the forests were transformed into savannas and later into steppe lands. If I may make a digression on the relations between Sumerian and Dravidian, I would point out that A. Sathasivan of Colombo University, as everyone knows, took up an unambiguous position in this matter. He was sure Sumerian writing was of Dravidian origin. Better still, Sumerian was a Dravidian language. I would refer you to the two following works: Sumerian, our Dravidian language, and the Dravidian origin of Sumerian writing. This theory, which it is difficult to refute when one considers how pellucidly clear and profound the demonstration is, confirms the conclusion reached by Father H. Harris of Bombay's, namely that the culture of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa predates Sumerian culture, and very likely the latter was produced by the former. The only difficulty surrounding the controversy about the Indus Valley civilization predating the Sumerian is that, according to the archaeologists Sir John Marshall and Sir Mortimer Wheeler, to be precise, the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa civilization must have arisen during the 3rd millennium before our era, 2800 BC, while the Sumerian civilization was already in existence 4000 BC. But according to Father H. Harris, the Proto-Indian people, the Dravidian people as it happens, had distributed their zodiac signs and devised their system for the division of time about 4980 BC. This view was confirmed by Father A. Romana, who was at the time director of Observatorio dell'Ebro, Tortosa, when he said that the beginning of the Aries constellation among the Mohenjo-Darians coincided with the winter solstice that year, 4980 BC. In this way, Father H. Harris, with this declaration as a basis and his own reading of 3 inscriptions, asserted that Mohenjo-Daro belongs to the 5th millennium before our era. After this long digression, let us now go back to the kinship between the Dravidian and Negro African languages, taking a look at the authors who have dealt with the subject. Miss Lillian Hamburger. In Jules Bloch's book, The Grammatical Structure of Dravidian Languages, had recognized a number of morphemes which are to be met with in several Saharan idioms. Since then, the idea of kinship between the Dravidian languages and certain Negro-African languages had become dear to her heart. And so, she began to study in succession the Senegalese Guinean languages, Mende, Bantu, and Ancient Egyptian, comparing them with the Dravidian language. This is what led her to publish the following articles in turn: Dravidian elements in Fuel, the Telugu and Mende dialects, the Kanara Bantu's few elements common to the Egyptian and Dravidian languages, and sibilants in Sindo. African. The point worth noting is that Miss Homburger was convinced of 2 things. 1, she was sure that the Dravidian languages make it possible to explain the morphology of the Senegalese group, particularly Serere Feul. 2, she was also convinced that there is a kinship between Canada and the Bantu languages. Indeed, the Bantu infinitive with a final, the subjunctive in either preterite in I or ID, the doer's name in I, are to be found with similar values in Canada and in other Dravidian languages. The Bantu causal suffix is is, and in Canada a suffix is u performs a similar function. The dative Kiu is characteristic of the Bantu groups and Canada and other Dravidian languages. It is a prefix in Bantu and a suffix in Kannada to completion. Unfortunately, Miss Homburger did not live to carry her theories. It is also worth drawing attention to Edwin H. Tuttle's publication on Nubian and Dravidian. The article, 10 pages long approximately, is a brief census of facts rather than a detailed study. Besides, it sheds no light on the nature of the kinship between Nubian and Dravidian. The only complete study so far undertaken is a thesis, which is now being prepared by a Senegalese, Cheikh Tidiane Ndiaye, on the kinship between the Wolof and Dravidian languages. This thesis, to which I attach great importance, deals with phonology, morphophonology, grammar, morphology and syntax, and lexicology. We hope the writer of the thesis has derived the maximum benefit from the 3 years he spent at Annamalai University as senior research fellow. The world's elder sons. If I have endeavored in this paper to advance reasons why the Institut Fondamental de l'Afrique Noire, IFAN, has created a Department of Indo-African Studies, it is, as you can imagine, to come to the following conclusion. It is of great advantage that Dravidians and the black people of Africa should get together and investigate through fundamental research the points of convergence, or rather of kinship, in the values of the civilizations characteristic of the two black worlds. The world of the black Dravidian and the world of the black African. I should like, by way of conclusion, to return to Lilius Hamburger, or to put it differently, to the time when, as a young professor of French, Latin, and Greek, I also attended lectures in prehistory and linguistics at the Paris Institute of Ethnology and the École Pratique des Hautes Études. It was then that I began to develop a certain vision of the past of the black peoples. In the Neolithic period, they occupied our Fertile Crescent and laid the foundations of civilization. By Fertile Crescent, in this particular context, I mean the arc of a circle stretching from the Straits of Gibraltar to the north of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Actually, the black peoples occupied the Mediterranean basin and the whole of southern Asia, with the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and the Indo-Chinese peninsula. It was they who laid the foundations of the first recorded civilizations of Egypt, Sumer, and India. The poetic works of the ancient Greeks were not mere flights of fancy, because they were in fact poiesis, that is to say, the expression of human realities. Now, as far as the ancient Greeks were concerned, the Ethiopians, in other words, the blacks, were the oldest inhabitants on earth and had invented religion and law, art and writing. When in those happy years, I looked at pictures reproduced in books. I mean pictures illustrating the pottery and sculpture of the early civilization of the Indus Valley. I was struck by a similarity in their style and the style that obtained in Black Africa. Therefore, I was not in the least surprised when in 1969 a flash from UNESCO announced that the writing of that early civilization expressed a Dravidian language. I managed to get hold of the pamphlet in which Mr. Asko Parpola of the Scandinavian Institute of Asiatic Studies told the story of how that writing was deciphered. The scholar whom I met last year reveals the fact that the language was a Dravidian language and that Hinduism was nothing more than the religion of the ancient Dravidians. It was a religion not far removed from that of the ancient Egyptians with their animal gods, but a religion thought out afresh by Aryan minds. This was the confirmation of the theory which, as a militant for negritude in the years 1930, I upheld with my friends Aimé Césaire and Léon Damas. That theory was, and still is, that far from being ashamed of our black skin and our original values of civilization, we should be proud of them. For in the words of Césaire, who invented the term negritude, we are the world's elder sons. And I will say that before we became consumers, we had been for thousands of years the first producers of civilization.